All right, everybody. One Fun Guy podcast in the studio. Sorry we are late tonight, guys. We had an emergency with one of our guests. She wasn't able to make it, but we have our horror movie podcast starting. This is the first time I've done a podcast with more than just me and one guest. So we'll see how it goes. It's kind of, trial by fire. We'll see what happens. When Ashley's able to come back on next month, we'll have her back on. We'll do the same thing again. But tonight is all about horror movies. So everybody on, take a second, introduce yourselves.
Ladies first.
Hi, I'm Shena Collins. I have a podcast called Bantering Fool. I'm a cancer survivor and thriver, and I talk about being the best versions of ourselves and how we do it. And I love horror movies, so because it's way better because real life is way scarier.
Right.
Go ahead.
Okay, my name's Mirah. This is my dad. I really like horror movies and I like to write horror shorts because I don't like writing elongated horror movies because they bother me.
My name is James Walker. I am not a I'm not a huge horror movie buff, but I have my favorites, but I'm a movie guy, so I love movies. So any genre of movies, I can probably talk. I'm a friend of Marco's. We've known each other for over a quarter century now. And I've been on the podcast before where we talked about wrestling, so he brought me back for the horror movie. So
awesome. Well, we'll start there. What's everybody's favorite horror movie? Sheno, you go first. What's your favorite? What's your go-to?
Well, I love the movie The Others. I know with Nicole Kidman, it's more of a suspense thriller, but that was like a movie that gripped me, and I was like, ah. And one of my other favorites for more of a slasher flick is I love the movie American Psycho with Christian Bale. So yeah,
Pat Bateman.
Yep.
See, for me, it's genres. Like I can't just do one horror movie. So I'll go maybe Night of the Living Dead, the remake. It's probably one of my favorite horror movies is in the zombie genre. And then I like American Werewolf in London.
Oh, that's a good one.
To this day, that is still the most terrifying on-screen werewolf I have ever seen. I have a figure of it downstairs. I collect action figures, so I've got this huge collection of figures downstairs. And Nika Toys, they make 7-inch scale action figures, and they have an actual figure of that werewolf, and I have it downstairs. And even as a small toy this big, I see that and it still creeps me out. Like that is a terrifying werewolf. To this day, it still scares me. Mirah?
Wait, I literally have my answer. Okay, my favorite horror movie.
You gotta speak up.
My favorite horror movie is either I rewatch Chucky a lot, but I really like horror movies, so my favorite is Wrong Turn.
That's a good one.
That is good.
Specifically 3. I really like Wrong Turn 3.
Nice. And my go-to is Halloween, right? So obviously it's no secret. I've always been a fan. It was just one of those movies as a kid that I saw it the first time, and it was like the one movie with that character that just kind of imprinted in my mind. So obviously I've seen thousands of horror movies, all the 80s, all the 90s, all the 2000s, but nothing was more terrifying than the music and the cinematography of Halloween, right?
I like part 2 better than 1, though.
They were both good, but one was the one that
it's almost one movie. If you
it's right. It picks up right where it left off, and it probably could have been right. They could have made a 4-hour horror movie with it, but it just the ambiance, the character, the setting like that movie did it for me. And then obviously I have like, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is up there. Like that was just kind of like ambient because it was the first time I saw a horror movie and it basically said this is based on real life events. And it just kind of like triggers like, was this guy real? Like, and so obviously it was, based loosely on Ted Bundy and Ed Gein, but it was like the events around it were just kind of like, it was kind of shocking. And so obviously that was there for me. So, and obviously there's, I mean, 100 other ones I could name. And I'll go as far as to say that for whatever reason, I don't know why, and I've told this story 100 times, but when I was a kid, I had Phantasm, and I started watching it, and about 4 minutes into the movie, my mom says, "You're not watching this. Turn it off. You're done. You cannot watch this." So of course, as like an 8, 9-year-old kid, I'm like, I gotta see this. Why can't I watch this movie? Right? There's obviously something, because my mom's never said that about any movies. Like my parents were very like kind of easygoing in that like genre where like horror movies didn't really bother me. I watched like gruesome movies, but for whatever reason, my mom within 5 minutes turned that movie off. Said, "You're not watching this." So obviously now I'm itching, right? I'm like, what is so bad about this movie? So I remember I waited. They all went to bed. I ran downstairs, hit the VCR, hit play, and watched it. And I could see why. It was like terrifying for that age of like what it was. But I remember like that was the one movie I was like, I was so engulfed in watching because I was told I couldn't watch it. So it always got a special place because it was like that was the movie for me. So those three are kind of like special for me.
A movie that kind of did something similar to me, even though it's not horror, but it's still gory, it's RoboCop.
Mm-hmm.
All the violence, because at that age in 1987 as a 7-year-old, I didn't realize that all that gore was supposed to be like silly. It was meant to be over the top silly, but it was so violent. In my mind at 7 couldn't fathom like, oh, this is we're over exaggerating the blood splatter here. We're over exaggerating this violence, So that
do you know a
I'm still traumatized by RoboCop.
do you know what is special about RoboCop?
What's special about it?
Yeah, there's a certain thing about it that sticks out that most people don't know.
Mm-mm.
When it came out, it was the first movie with an X rating.
Oh yeah,
for
violence.
Really?
Violence, right?
They had to take out 4 scenes in the movie to get the R rating.
They
edited it and they took out scenes because they said it was too overly graphically violent, that it was rated X, and at that time they wouldn't put it out as a major motion picture unless it went indie, and they said no, we want it to be a major motion picture, so they took out scenes and edited the movie so it was able to get an R rating and be shown on cinema screens.
And what's funny? I have the unedited version downstairs. It was on DVD. The changes are so little that I'm like, really? That like when he got his hand shot off in the original, you just see his hand just get blown off. You don't see it in the remake, in the edit. In the original, you see it hit, and all of a sudden it just goes whoosh, like it's like a fountain of blood just shoots out his hand. But when they edited, recut it, it was just like he just blew his hand off. You saw like the spark, and that was it. And then like there's a scene when Ed 209 shoots the executive. The blood splatter, like they're in the uncut version, blood splatters all over the camera. In the edited version that they released, it doesn't splatter on the camera. So it's little small things like that. But you can see like this, it's edited so bad, you can see the squib packs when his you can see the squib packs, and you see like a white mask under, like it's like you can see it. It's like this, so like that's clearly fake, like you can see all the squib packs under his shirt. It's like, oh come on, this is bad.
I must have grown up twisted because my mom worked second shift and she'd get home and she'd wake me up because she didn't want to watch scary movies alone. So she would always wake me up in the middle of the night to get up and watch scary movies with her. And one of my earliest memories was of scary movies that like I think scarred me for life was I had to be 4 or 5. And I grew up in a little small town in Iowa, and our local theater was playing Planet of the Apes and the Amityville Horror, and my cousins took me to it. I mean, I had to be like 4, 5. I remember being so scared, and then I had this bizarre fascination with Amityville Horror, and I still do.
It's great, right? That's probably one
The
of the
house is iconic. Yeah.
foremost ghost stories ever, right? The ghost and demonic possession, right? So I mean, that's that kind of set the standard for a lot of those movies, right? Like you had The Exorcist, but as far as like a story being told, the Amityville was way ahead of its time. That was
Yeah.
Did you guys ever see the remake with Ryan Reynolds?
that
I
wasn't
loved
terrible.
it. Oh, I
didn't-
loved it
didn't-
only because Ryan Reynolds took off his shirt. I'm sorry, guys.
Yeah,
Me and my girlfriend went and saw it. We were like, wow.
Yeah, it was good. I mean, obviously it's hard to beat the originals, but like there's certain ones that come through every now and then that surprise me, where the remakes were better than the originals. The Amityville was close. It was good. I mean,
That Nightmare on Elm Street remake wasn't bad.
it wasn't.
I don't think it got the publicity and the hype it should have. But Jackie Earl Haley as Freddy,
Yeah.
he played a more serious version, and he was pretty terrifying as Freddy. It's hard to follow Robert Englund, because Robert Englund played him for
That's who is the character.
But his take on Freddy was pretty terrifying. Like he was very serious. And I love the twist. Spoiler alert if anybody hasn't seen it. I love the twist is how they made you think that Freddy was innocent the whole time in that remake. Like they made it seem like the parents killed him off of a lie, and it was all. But then when you find out, when the kids when the grown up teenagers all get to the bottom, he's like, no, I was it. I was the bad guy. I wasn't molesting the children. It's like, oh my god.
I was talking about it in the car, and I was like, wait, he did. I was defending him, and they're like, wait, no, he did what?
Yeah, like that was a good, interesting twist how they made you feel sorry for Freddy. Like, oh man, that's messed up how they did him. And he's like, no, he was a bad guy all along.
Right. Yeah.
Jeez.
Yeah. There were some. So like, as far as like, for what, like one that comes to mind for me was The Conjuring, right? Like they basically took a story that existed based on real people, but they took every bit of like The Exorcist, Amityville, The Challenging. They took all these like ghost possession movies and kind of combined them into one. Mm-hmm. And like The Conjuring is like, for me, it's technically not a remake, but they took the aspects of all the movie. I thought The Conjuring was fantastic. It was one of my favorite movies in the last.
Spinoffs are great too. Like I think they plan on making a movie like of every artifact in that room.
Yeah.
So you had the Nun, you've had the Red Door, you've
Annabelle.
had Annabelle. Like everything in that room has had its own movie. The La Llorona. So yeah, like that's a really good. I think that's a cool concept to have like a movie where it has all these things in a room. It's like, yeah, very similar to Tales in the Crypt. Yeah. What you know about Tales in the Crypt?
Yeah, and so that's the thing, right? Like when we were talking, like as a kid, there was a lot less access to like horror movies, right? Like growing up in the Chicagoland area, we had Svengoolie, right? So on Sunday afternoons, mid mornings at 11:30, you would have him play these weird alien movies and old horror movies, and kind of made a spoof out of it, right? Like it wasn't
Briggs too,
but and the movies were great. But I remember as a kid on Channel 9, you had Tales from the Dark Side. Mm-hmm. Then you had the show V, which was
I love that.
Right, the alien kind of horror show. And then after that, if you were lucky enough to have cable television, that led right into Tales from the Crypt. So you had like public access horror, and then you had real like graphically violent, cable horror. But
didn't Elvira have a show back in the day too?
Elvira was Mistress of the Dark, so she would play like all the old cult 50s and 60s movies. That was kind of her thing. So all the spin-offs of all the Draculas, all the Frankensteins, all the mummies, she kind of had that. I I think Svengoolie had more of the aliens and creature movies, and then uh, Briggs had more of the kind of the slasher-esque type movies on his thing. He'd had all those 70s and 80s like cult slasher movies. That was kind of like his thing. So you had access to a lot of it, and then even prior to that, right in the 50s and 60s, you had, the Twilight Zone, which was, probably the precursor to everything horror that we know of as far as like modern day stories that are being told, minus the 30s and early 40s monster movies, right? Between your
Yeah,
Dracula,
you had
Frankenstein,
Outer Limits, and then
Werewolf, Outer Limits, you had,
what,
Ooh,
Black
Outer
Mirror,
Limits was good.
yeah.
I like watching right now. Speaking of
yeah.
Svengoolie, it's called Creature Features,
Hmm.
and you can
Mhm.
watch the shows. I love the hosts. I love Vincent and Tangela and all them. I like the banter around, and they play some good old ones and some cheesy ones,
Yeah.
and yeah, it's fun.
Because even later on, when you had Alfred Hitchcock, right, and you had his little mini series of what he did, then they brought those stories back, right? So you had a lot of those kind of mystery suspense stories being told in a more horror realm, which is kind of like I said, your precursors to like modern day movies. But I
Mhm.
mean, back in the day, those, when we watch them now, we're like, oh, that's not scary. But can you imagine being in the 60s and watching that show? Like, you turn on the TV and you see the Twilight Zone, like that. You didn't see anything else prior to that, right? You didn't, like, that was believable at that point, and it was so far ahead of its time.
Yeah, the episode To Serve Man. You
Yeah,
ever see that episode?
yeah,
Yeah, like I can imagine that'd be terrifying.
you know,
Like even the idea if they even remade that, the idea of aliens coming to Earth and catering to every human need,
yeah,
and basically convincing us, hey, yeah, come back to our planet.
right,
Now we're
yeah,
going to eat you.
yeah,
Serve man, as
yeah,
into cook and
those
serve.
they were all great. I remember the one, specifically the one with Burgess Meredith, where he had the monocle and he had
Mhm.
the glasses, and he had the entire world to himself, and he was blind without his glasses, and he basically loses his glasses and steps on him, and now he can't see.
Mhm.
So he's got the world to himself, and there's nothing he can do. So it's just those kind of thought process things psychologically were, way, 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 way far ahead of their time. That was, the kind of, stories though that are being told now in horror movies. Especially that. So let's go out of that to like favorite movies. If you had to pick a movie now that still has relevance that it did back then, what movie would you say has the most staying power of all the movies?
Ooh.
Exorcist.
I would agree that's probably high up there.
Exorcist will always be scary because the idea of demonic possession, like they keep trying to capture lightning in a bottle with all these exorcism movies. They keep
Mhm.
trying to do it over and over, and they have just not. It has not been as good as the original Exorcist.
Yeah, that's true. And speaking of the exorcisms, the movie The Exorcism of Emily Rose, that
Mhm.
one like was super scary for me. Boy, for staying power, oh, I have a hard time. You know, Altered States was a really interesting, creepy one for an older
Mhm.
one that I like. But I would have to agree that The Exorcist is pretty much, yeah. When people think of horror and scary, and you're right, they're always trying to reinvent possession and things like that.
And you
Yeah.
look at all the when they have these like American film, all the great lists of the greatest horror movie of all time. Exorcist is always like top 3.
Yeah.
Yeah, everybody's list. Yeah, they always voted this.
And even the sequels of it were creepy. Like I
Yeah.
remember when they came out, it was trippy, and I can't remember if it was The Exorcist 2 or 3, which one it was, but whichever scene where she's crawling on the ceiling, and oh my gosh, that was like freaking me out.
Hmm? Speak up, kid.
Oh, I was going to.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, just shout it out if you got anything. Just yell.
Oh, I was gonna say The Ring because I feel like anybody who's watched that has been like terrified. I was terrified to turn TV on for a week. I didn't watch the tape. I didn't touch the tape.
Did you watch the
Watch the
version?
Yeah.
Okay.
They both hurt me a lot.
Yeah, I think the which one had the like I've seen the original because I remember back in the days of eBay or when you only before Amazon. I remember going on eBay and ordering the Japanese version subtitles.
Yeah, that's Ringu.
Yeah, Ringu. Yeah, I remember ordering that off of eBay to watch it, and I didn't because I wanted to see that before I saw the one at the theater, the American version, and it's funny because like I forget I don't know if it's the Japanese version where once the person's dead and you see that look on their face like they're all waterlogged and drowned once they're dead. I can't remember which one. I can't remember if it was the American or the Japanese version had a really nasty look. Like once they were dead and they were all like they were. Was it the Japanese version? Yeah, it was the Japanese version. Was really like it looked horrible. Like their bodies been sitting in water for like years, but they dead like 10 minutes ago.
Yeah. So obviously The Exorcist is up there, but I think Poltergeist is probably the one that has, because out of all the movies that were made after that, you didn't really have the idea of kids and being able, because The Exorcist, you had the little girl, right? Like you obviously had that, but like the Poltergeist, I think, put a spin on it to where like people were afraid of the dark. They were afraid of dolls. They were afraid of clowns. Right. So it had this whole like subgenre within a movie of like what you could do, right? And I remember when, obviously we're all dating ourselves now. Mirah, you're not going to understand this, but back in the day, you had two box TVs, and it was not uncommon for them to go static, right? You'd be watching a movie and you would just see it. And I remember watching Poltergeist, and as a kid, when the TV went static, I would freak out. I'd be like, and so like, it's we don't have that problem now with the LCD and the plasmas and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, when your TV went static as a kid, that was the first thing that popped into your mind was like, is my TV possessed? Like, is something like abnormal now? And it's like, and I think like the staying power of that movie, I think with all the other movies that have been made prior and after that, I think with just the way that it was so perfectly done, I think that one has the most, in my opinion, is probably the strongest for staying power. So with that question out of the way, what do you think was like the worst movie ever made, right? Like what was the horror movie that you're like, this is just so dumb, I can't even take it?
Oh man, I got it in my head. Shit, what's the name of that movie? It was like a zombie movie that was like the priest was like, oh, I can't think of it. It was like a kung fu priest, and he was like fighting zombies, and then he picks up a lawnmower, turns it upside down, and starts mowing down zombies. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, the Bruce. What the heck's his name? I know what you're talking about.
It wasn't Evil Dead.
No, it's I could think of the guy with the Army of Darkness.
It's not Army of Darkness.
Oh, no. I love Army of Darkness.
It's not Army of Darkness. It's called,
it's not Kung Fu Zombie, is it?
No. Oh shoot, what is it? It's a weird movie. Yeah, I can't think of the name.
Because I think like in terms of worst zombie movies, for me it's got to be Bubba Hotep.
Has to be what?
Bubba Hotep. It's like
I've not
Elvis.
seen that.
Don't waste your time. I mean, it's funny, like goofy, funny, but like it's just
Dead Alive. It's called Dead Alive. That's it. Horrible.
Dead Alive.
It is gory. It is gross, and it's just horrible. It's one of the movies that's so bad that it might be delightfully good. Like it's to watch it. It's like, okay, I know this movie's trash, but it's entertaining because it's so bad.
Yeah.
And it's just so gross. Like it's just gross. Like ugh.
But you had a lot of those like 80s cheesy movies like The Toxic
Especially
Avenger, right?
Tromaville movies. Yeah, the Troma movies.
Yeah, that are
The
just kind of
Troma
like
movies.
they were just made for quirky, bizarre, sexual innuendos, blatant nudity. Like they were just made for that genre. Like there was no rhyme or reason about it. It was,
Yeah, good old Lloyd Kaufman.
yeah, right.
So the one that I think is the stupidest horror movie I've ever seen is it's called Lair of the White Worm, and Hugh Grant is in it. I mean, you would be shocked to see Hugh Grant in a horror flick. It is called The Lair of the White Worm. It is so bad. So bad.
Yeah. For me, I go with the obvious answer is the Blair Witch. I cannot stand that movie.
Oh, they
I don't
hyped
know
that
why
up.
it was
I was
made.
so excited. I was like in college when that came out, and a bunch of us went to the theater. We were pumped, and it was like, that's it.
I was the exact same way. I'm like, this was a giant waste of my 2 hours.
Right. Because you never saw The Witch.
You never saw anything.
Was that like the
No.
first found footage movie?
It was one of them. Yeah,
One of
it was.
them.
They get credit for starting it, but I mean, there was a lot of those, old 70s cult movies where like you would find, they'd walk into to a room and they would find a tape, right? And they would pop it in and it would start of that. So I think it was the first one where it was like modern day, right? Where it was like what was on the camera, let's watch it and see, and it kind of takes you back through everything. But for me, it was just, it added up to a giant disappointment. Like it was a letdown. Like, at least let us see The Witch, right? Let us see what is going on, right? Like even the movie The Witch, for example, right? Like it kind of started off slow, but at least at the end, you're like, you see the witches, like you're like, oh, well, that makes sense now, right?
Mm-hmm. I'd say one movie that perfected that found footage was Paranormal Activity.
Nah, that was great.
Those were great.
The thing was, when Paranormal Activity first came out, people were questioning was that real, right?
Yeah, the first one was good.
Yeah, they didn't know if that was fake or
real,
not, right? That was the big, like, kind of, I think, oomph around Paranormal Activity was like, is this real? Like, is this really footage of somebody's like camera? And obviously it was a movie and it, they made it known. But after that first one, that was, but the Blair Witch was just a giant letdown for me. I have to say it was the worst.
I agree with that. Yes.
They made like a sequel, but it was an actual movie. It wasn't found footage. It was like Blair Witch 2, but it was an actual like movie.
Well, because they tried to make up for how bad the first one was, right? And the thing is they duped everybody, right? Because how many people went to see the Blair Witch and like people were saying how great of a movie it was, and you got to see this, and you got to see this, and like they built up the hype. When I watched it, I was like, I don't what is everybody seeing this? Like it is awful. Like I didn't think any of it was scary. There was no like even like the kind of pop horror, right? Where like they'll make a noise or like somebody will jump. Like there was nothing. It was just mundane throughout. And the end was a gigantic disappointment. You don't see anything but a tree with a symbol on it. Who cares? Prove anything.
Yeah.
And it's funny too, because you don't think about it as a horror movie necessarily.
No.
But how many people as a kid saw Wizard of Oz as like one of their first movies? That witch was terrifying.
Yeah.
The flying monkeys, man, they were scary.
Yeah, and you don't think of it like as a horror movie, but like that is most kids' childhood traumas is that witch.
Well, see, I saw The Wiz before I ever saw Wizard of Oz.
Okay.
With Ross and Michael Jackson. Yeah. And I remember the flying monkeys in there were terrorized. That was horrible. No, those are nasty looking things. And I remember because they were on motorcycles.
Yeah.
They were the flying monkeys. They were on motorcycles. Their bodies were like attached to the motorcycles. So they were like a humanoid monkey cyborg motorcycle. Yeah. So it was just weird. I'm like, hey, I saw The Wiz before I ever saw Wizard of Oz. Yeah.
Yeah, but I it's just funny because like you think of stuff like that. Like if I think of a scary witch, I'm thinking Wizard of Oz, right? Like I'm like, this is a terrifying witch. I don't think of the Blair Witch as being terrifying at all.
No.
Like it wasn't. It was just dumb. So that's my vote for that.
What do you think?
Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
What do you think is the scariest monster archetype? Like vampires, mummies, zombies, werewolves.
So obviously the smart answer is Dracula, right? Because how many vampire movies have been made in the past century, right? Like you think about dating all the way back to Nosferatu in 1929 to where it is now. Even the Universal Dracula, right? Like Bela Lugosi, like that imprinted most people's minds of what modern day vampire is. So that's the smart answer. But I think the trivial answer is Frankenstein, right? Like that was more terrifying than Dracula, right? Like the concept of the monster was, I think, more, scary in terms of like horror than like vampire. Like, in my opinion, I would say Frankenstein was probably the one that was kind of offsetting.
For me, it's werewolves. Like, I don't know what it is. Even like I said, go back to American Werewolf in Paris.
Yeah.
Something about a werewolf is just absolutely terrifying to me. Like, a person, and you've seen different werewolves over the years. You've seen Lon Chaney back in the day when he's just like has hair,
right,
all the way to like Underworld where they grow up to like 7 feet of height, jacked with muscles, or what was the silver one where the dog fights him?
Silver Bullet.
Silver Bullet, yeah. That one was a terrifying looking one. And I've always liked practical effect werewolves. Like CGI werewolves don't look good to me. Like I remember they ginger snaps that movie. Like the CGI werewolf is just Underworld CGI werewolf looks cool, but they were meant to look.
Yeah.
They weren't look scary. They were meant to look cool and like something you fight, but like for werewolves to look scary, like Silver Bullet, American Werewolf in London.
So I think the two cool CGI werewolves is actually the movie Wolf with Jack Nicholson, where you see him transform into the wolf with the black back and the yellow eyes. And then another good show that did a really good job was True Blood.
Yeah.
With how they turned into wolves, right?
Like, to me that wasn't really a werewolf though. Like, because to me when I think of werewolf, I think of you turn into a humanoid wolf, not you just turn into a wolf. That's a shapeshifter.
Yeah. So I don't know. I just thought it was very good the way that they did it, right? Because they were like, after they turned from wolf back to human, they were like their energy was low and they needed time to like recover, and that they were, all the girls were good looking and all the guys were ripped, right? You didn't see like, in the vampire world, right? You had the overweight dorky vampire. You had the nerdy looking girl, right? That was the vampire. And but the wolves were all jacked.
Yeah. They're people. Yeah.
So it was kind of made for the most sense to say, okay, any sloth could be a vampire, but like to be a wolf, you had to be like in shape. Like they were the best looking girls and the best looking guys that were the wolves, right? All the nerds and dorky people were vampires.
They did that in the movie too. I think they did in the Ginger Snaps movie, like how she was really awkward looking, but once she became a werewolf, all of a sudden she was like she had a big glow up, where she was really attractive. Well, obviously, they just did her hair, dressed her differently, put some makeup on, but they made it to where like being a werewolf just made you more attractive because somehow you gave off these like primal pheromones all of a sudden now,
Yeah. And then the thing with like the when we look at like the Universal monsters, right? Like there's never really been a good mummy movie made, right? Like they've made a few, they've kind of incorporated them, but they kind of always drop the ball, right? The Creature from the Black Lagoon kind of fell off, right? There's been monster movies, but like they kind of, they ran with Dracula, Werewolf, and Frankenstein. And then obviously the big one was Dracula, right? Because how many Frankenstein movies have been made? How many mummy and werewolf movies have been made? But when you look at vampire movies, there's been hundreds of thousands of them made. So I don't know what the appeal of the vampire was versus, why they didn't run with all the other ones. But it seems that Dracula was the one that blew up
Well, I think the
per se.
vampire. I think there's a seduction to vampires.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
was
the
gonna
mystique
say
is
there's a
there.
romanticism to the
Yeah,
vampires.
like even the idea of like him, you in his embrace.
Mhm.
How he chants you. Like he's very suave and debonair, and he's like, and because he's the king of the vampires, so
Right.
he's just like he's like evil incarnate, but yet he's so alluring. There's a romanticism to a vampire.
Yeah.
Whereas a werewolf is just a brooding beast that's just going to tear you apart. Or Frankenstein. The Frankenstein's monster is just he's basically a put together super zombie.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just kind of it's unique when you look at the perspective of like what transpires
And I think
between the
because
characters.
because also with vampires he can duplicate it. Like
Mhm.
Frankenstein can't duplicate himself. Werewolves, you can turn people into werewolves, but it doesn't. But they're just like a pack of animals. Whereas Dracula he has the brides. He can make other vampires. He can make him to
Mhm.
ghouls. He can have a whole vampire army all from his direct lineage. And he can control them too. So I think
Yeah.
I think just because, and then Dracula is also like a personality. He's not just a monster. He's a person still. And and the fact that vampires live forever, so he has the knowledge of ages. He's been around since. It depends what vampire lore you look at.
Mhm.
What was the Dracula 2000 where they basically said
Yeah.
it was Judas?
Yeah.
He was Judas Messias. That was cool.
Yeah.
That was a cool spin on the kid. He had been around since betraying
Right.
Christ.
Yeah, they have, it's weird because like you get obviously the imagery of horror, right? And even, as far as to say as like devils in movies, right? Which
Mhm.
you find it portrayed very mystically, right? Like you have some movies where the devil is this evil, two-horned monster with a pointy tail and the
Mhm.
wings, and then you have some movies where the devil's just a guy, right? Like he's just a person.
So
So
well
it's a
dressed man.
unique spin on like, and I think the vampire has that kind of same
Yeah.
allure, right? Where it could be a person, it could be a monster, it could be, this oddity, but it could also just be a human, right? It could just be a
Or you can
person.
interchange between,
Yeah.
like
You know what my
Stephen
favorite
Novel.
vampire movie is? Abe Lincoln, the vampire killer. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but that is like
Yeah, I've
my
I
seen
have.
it.
favorite vampire movie ever.
That was a comic book first.
Yeah.
They
I don't know.
actually have
That's a
they have
tough
another
one.
book, something like that. It's like Harriet Tubman Demon Slayer or something like that.
Yeah. Right.
Really?
Yeah, it's another comic. Yeah,
Have to check it out.
Yeah. Vampire movies are obviously like, it's hard to pick just one, right? Because like, I think for me it's hard to depict anything else but the Lost Boys, right? Like being a product
Yes.
of the 80s, right? That was kind of the movie, right? That was,
Yes.
and not to say the iterations of the 50s, 60s, and 70s vampires weren't good, but like the soundtrack, the ambiance,
yeah.
the
That was like a
allure.
modern. That was a modern telling of it because before that, even when you had the old Hammer House with Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing,
Yeah.
they took place. Well, I think the first few took place in like the 1800s, but then the later ones took place in the 70s,
Right.
but it still felt dated. You know what I mean? It
Yeah.
did still feel very. It was like old school Victorian era Dracula just dropped into the 70s,
Yeah.
so it wasn't like he was evolved with the times. Whereas Lost Boys is like, okay, these vampires have been living in the 1980s, so they are modern 19.
Mhm.
They're basically teenagers in the 1980s, but they've been teenagers forever because they were turned as teenagers,
Yeah.
So they still act like rambunctious, angsty teenagers, but they're vampires.
Right.
And they're all beholden to that. Because they had the master vampire, which is like that, the old dude, right?
Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was one. And then obviously I think Blade is another one, right? That was kind of that
I
that
wrote
took,
that down. I love Blade.
Yeah.
you know, Blade was another one, and then obviously one of mine is Dust Till Dawn, right? Like
Oh yeah.
you
Oh, that is so good.
you
That
know,
tripped
so
me out. I had no idea that that was going to be a vampire movie, but I loved Quentin Tarantino. And when
yeah,
that came out, I went to the theater. They never said it was going to be about vampires,
Mhm.
you
I remember
know?
when,
And then you
yeah.
have Cheech out there giving his spiel out in front
yeah,
of the club. And then all of a sudden, that chick just morphs into and like they start this killing. It was like mind blowing. I was like, what?
yeah.
I'm like, Quentin Tarantino doing vampires? Are you serious?
I
But it was
remember me and my
good.
dad went to go see that, and I was like, Dad, let's go see this movie, Dust Till Dawn. And he's like, okay, whatever. You know, my dad would go along with every movie I wanted to see with him, right? And so we go to see the movie and we're watching it, and he's like, okay, it's just probably gonna be kind of a cool crime action movie. And then when Salma Hayek turns to a vampire, he's like, Jamie, what the hell you got me watching? And I was like, whoa, I didn't know. I knew it was gonna be a vampire. I knew there was gonna be vampires in it, but I didn't realize it was gonna be that type of movie.
Yeah.
Like that was almost a bait and switch movie, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's because I remember like when I was a kid, obviously they were running off of Top Gun, right? Like that was like the biggest blockbuster movie of the 80s. And then, you know, they did the what was it, with Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise, where they did Interview with the Vampire, right? And it was kind of like, it was cool, but it didn't have the wow factor like Top Gun had, right? They were trying to relive the magic of those two. And for me, I think that movie, like when I watch it now, I appreciate it. But when I watched it as a kid, I was like, this is stupid. Like, this is just a giant letdown. Like, why would they even make this?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and it was just kind of, you know, weird. And then I liked the one with Keanu Reeves, where they actually did it based off the book. That was pretty cool. But I really like it was is just kind of like, I think with the way that the genre was through the 80s of making like these just weird cheesy ones, right? But I
Fright
remember like
Night. That's a classic.
Fright Night was awesome. And then I remember Once Bitten, right, with Jim Carrey.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that was kind of like, you know, you had these like kind of like 80s themed, you know, fun movies where they were trying to put like a horror spin on it, right? And even the Nightmare on Elm Streets, right? When you rewatch them now, like all the jokes they cracked in those movies, like all the one-liners with Freddy, like you're like, I never picked up on that when I was 9, but now it's funny, right? You chuckle at the cheesiness of that, right?
Yeah.
You know, one movie though from back in the 80s that was so scary, and it still is scary and gross at this time, was Silent Night, Deadly Night.
Yeah.
All I think about is that scene where he sets the guy up on the big deer rack and is like, "Whoa," and it's like, oh my gosh. And I
Yeah.
got in such trouble from my mom because I went to a slumber party and we watched it, and my mom was like, even though she was like, you know, watch horror movies with me, watch that, she's like, don't watch the bloody stuff.
Yeah. Right. And even you just said it, right? Slumber Party was awesome. Sleepaway Camp was
Yes.
like a big slasher movie, right? Like you had a lot of these good movies that like when you watch them now, you're like cheesy, but like when you were a kid, like those were like the movies that you wanted to watch, right? Like
Yes.
you and another one that I remember that was terrifying was Monkey Shines, right?
Oh my gosh, yes.
And you don't think, right, like that, you know, you have, you know, a monkey that like is kind of like a helper monkey that turned like just something so easy, right? Like the minds of people that wrote stories back then were just incredible, right? Like just something as simple as a pet helping animal that turns on you, right? Like that's
Yeah. Have you guys seen any of the modern Korean zombie movies like Train to Busan?
So I've watched a couple of them, and they're very good, right? It's a very interesting subgenre of these Asian movies that are coming out, and I think only because of the fact that they are a lot more free to write things that are obscure, where here it's kind of like shock value, right? Like they write stories based on fear, right? What is actually scary, whereas here we write on like what gets the jump, right? Like what gets the their movies are just eerily terrifying.
Yeah.
it's a very creepy thing if you haven't seen these Asian horror movies. Like they're very well thought. It's almost like
Yeah, my
Squid
oldest
Games.
put me on to the Asian horror movies.
Yeah, it's like because everyone saw Squid Games, right? Like that's kind of like the bulk of it. But if you imagine Squid Games more creepy and more terrifying, those are what those Korean movies, especially Japan and Korea, those horror movies are graphically violent.
Yeah.
Huh.
It's just hard because they're
Sweet
subtitled.
Home?
Yeah.
Yeah, Sweet Home is another one where like these people are turning into like these monsters, and they're like the whole world's just going to hell in a handbasket. But instead of zombies, people are being turned into these monsters, and like you have to like.
It's their anger that causes, like, if they have like any deep regrets or anger towards anything, the nose will start bleeding, they'll turn into monsters.
Okay, yeah. So she says like their anger turns them into monsters. They have regrets. So it's like if you're just basically an emotionally scarred person, you turn into one of these monsters.
Huh.
Yeah, because you see us like that. That's like very weird horror movie, which is actually really good. Like it's hard because you have to read the subtitles. But like when you get past that, like you actually watch the movie, they're like violently like good. They're like eerily satisfying.
Yeah, those Train to Busan movies, man. Like it's something about the Korean zombie is so much more scarier than the American zombie. Like especially because the actors they contort themselves and they like and they pop up and they're running. I've always think like zombies are like old school George Romero zombies. They're scary, but you can deal with them. It's like, okay. But because that's the whole point of the George Romero zombies. Like, okay, if it's one or two, you just ignore them. And they're harmless. But, well, not harmless, but, we were. But then when there's a horde and you can't escape, now it's scary, But when you got zombies that are jumping, running, and tackling you, that's terrifying. Because they're like, you're going to get tired. They're not. They're just running. They're on like unlimited adrenaline. So to try to outrun them, you can't because they don't get tired. There's no lactic acid building up in their muscles, and you're going to get winded. So they're going to catch you eventually.
Yeah. So like the World War Z zombie is kind of the one that everyone is like terrified of, right? Like they're quick and they're fast and they're hoarding.
You change quick too. And, you get bit, you change in like seconds.
But I think that the one unique thing about like even take Night of the Living Dead, right? The concept of that movie where people come back from the dead is not a new phenomenon, right? Like people they see people die and come back, all the time, right? Like there's been ancient text of people that have done that, right? Where they've been pronounced dead, they've been dead for a day, and then all of a sudden they come back to life. But the way that they did it, like in the cemetery scene, right? Like it's an abnormal setting. It's not like somebody on a hospital bed that's pronounced dead and then 20 minutes later they wake up, right?
Yeah.
This was like a cemetery where that these people have been dead for a long time, right? And the hand comes out of the ground, right? Like that then would have been terrifying if you're watching that, right? Because that's a new concept, right? No one has seen that on the big screen before, right? So when you drive past the cemetery at night, like you still think of those images, right? Of somebody coming out of a grave, right? Like that's a scary thought, right? So that those solidify horror to its like bone, right? And those movies are black and white and they're made in the 50s, but the concept of that movie, if you were watching that in a movie theater in the 1950s, you would have been terrified, right? That would have been something where on the ride home, if you went past the cemetery, you would think twice about people coming out of the graves. Like that's how conceptual that movie was, right? Now we're like, it's unreal, right? You're not going to have, somebody come back from the dead. Cemeteries are fine. They're not, but in that era of horror movies, like that would have been like spine tingling, terrifying.
Yeah. And even when you make zombie movies nowadays, you have to have an explanation behind it. Romero didn't give you an explanation.
No.
In all of his movies, it was never an explanation. It was just, they just came back. I know in the first movie, the first movie was in black and white, even though he purposely filmed it in black and white, even though it was in the 60s and they could have made it in color. But if you listen to the radio transmission, they say something about radiation or something. It's a very passing comment, but yeah, it was bottom line that Romero never told you why they came back. But you know, like everything else is like, well, such and such happened, or toxic way. They had to give you a reason why zombies
Yeah,
are running around.
right.
And that's one thing about Walking Dead. It was great too, is that they didn't give you an explanation. You
Yeah,
know,
they
like
shut up.
Robert Kirkman, just like but he basically said whatever it is, everybody's infected. So when you die, you're coming back because the whole world is infected by whatever is causing zombies to come back. You know, that's what made the comic book so great when I was reading the comic, because I was reading the comic, you know, before the show, but the show ran into the same thing the comic ran into. It was just, it got repetitive. You know, it was just like,
Yeah.
okay, we're on the run, we find a place to stay, we chill for a while, we get overrun by zombies, now we're on the run again, you know?
Yeah.
And it was
and the story's been told before, right?
repeat.
Like it's hard to elongate a zombie story because you know what eventually is going to happen, right? Like the humans are going to overtake the zombies and they're eventually going to win, right? Like that's kind of the story. How they present it is unique, right? What makes them separate from a zombie movie A, B, and C, right? What characteristics do they have? What is the acting like? Like what story do they tell? Because obviously we all know, right? Zombies are zombies. We are aware of the phenomenon now, right? But like you said, how they got there, where they're at, and then where they're going, right? Like that's kind of the evolution of it, right? And The Walking Dead did a pretty good job, I think, carrying that story out. Obviously, it trailed off, right? Because you can only tell so much of a story before it gets old. It's over, right? You know
the cool thing about Walking Dead too, even in, especially from the comics, you know, I read the comics long before I did the show. The threat wasn't necessarily the zombies; it was the corrosion of society and people not having rules to live by. You know, people not having order and society. That's what made that story so scary. It's like, yeah, you got these flesh-eating monsters that are run around and can kill you, but but those are easy to take care of. You can just, you know, kill one of them. It's the people that where society is completely eroded and now you have complete anarchy amongst people. That's what makes The Walking Dead so scary, is that people are living in a world with no rules, no laws, and no order. So they can do whatever they want and there's no consequences. That's what makes Walking Dead scary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the psychological, you know, theory behind it. I know you mentioned, you know, Shena earlier. We were talking about the Pat Bateman, you know, and the American Psycho, right? Like,
yeah.
That's a horror movie based on the fact that it's a horror-esque movie, right? Like it's a slasher movie. There's a lot of blood. There's a lot of violence. But when you look at the underlying characteristic of that movie, right? Most people, in theory, right, are looking at that as somebody who's bipolar, right? That like they have the schizophrenic ideology of killing people and playing this out, but they don't ever do it, right? And I think that was kind of mystique about American Psycho, was because it was like it was all in his head.
Yeah.
He made the whole basically thing up, but when you're watching the movie, you're like, how could somebody be so gruesome, right? How could somebody plan this, prepare for it, and then clean it up so easily, right? And you're like, you're watching it from a perspective, and then at the end of the movie, you realize like this was a guy battling these demons, right? Like that's what he was thinking about on a daily basis.
Yeah.
So it's a unique perspective based on like horror, like Silence of the Lambs plays that card, right? So it's not ultraly scary, right? Like the Silence of the Lambs, but like the creepy factor of that, right? Like the what if somebody was like this, right? Like could manipulate somebody's mind to make them pretty much do what they wanted to do and send them on a wild goose chase that doesn't make any sense. But in the end, it all makes sense, right? It was a very well put together movie.
Or the movie Seven. I mean, you think
Seven's
of that.
a great example, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
You know, and even with Seven, right? The underlying aspect of it, right? Like we pretty much know what's in the box, right? But we don't really know what's in the box, right? It's kind of the Pulp Fiction theory, right? Like it could be this, it could be this, it could be this, but we kind of know what it is, but we don't know what it is.
Yeah.
You know, and right. And I think that like, you know, movies that make people think can be more terrifying than the actual person that runs around and slaughters 30 people.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or creepy
Your mind.
cult stuff like Summer Wind. You know, like that's creepy. Children of the Corn, you know,
Yeah.
like that was freaky. That,
Yeah.
you know, where you're talking about that control, that mind control, or losing it, or The Shining, you know.
Yeah.
It's like,
So I think, right.
Thank
So
you,
so I
too.
think the one movie that really stands out, I think for a lot of people,
Mhm.
and the weird creepy factor was The Hills Have Eyes, right? Either
yes.
the original or the remake, right?
Yep.
Because we all know about these weird backwoods Appalachian people, and they are basically the next thing genetically to an animal that we're aware of, right? Like they're so far genetically compassed as humans, right? And I don't mean that in a bad way, right?
What
But
was the movie
they're
talking about?
The Hills Have Eyes.
Oh, Hills Have Eyes. Yeah.
So you know that there's these mountain people that are inbred, right? Like the genetic decline has been there over the course of years, right? That brothers and sisters are having kids, that their brothers and sisters are having kids,
Yeah.
that their brother, right? So you know the inbreeding is there, right? But to become so genetically deformed as a mutant, I think that movie woke people's eyes up to like, are these people really indigenous like that? Like, is this how they are? And I think that was like a big wake up call to like mountain people, right? Like, if you don't have access to civilization, how do you live? Like, you're obviously cross gening because you're creating people with your siblings. You don't have any.
Well, and that's really scary because, you know, it does verge on the point of real because
Right.
one of my church groups, and we also have a program called Orphan Grain Train, and we collect clothes and we send it into the deep Appalachias and into the mountains, and they only allow, it's dangerous. Like they send in a truck and those people only allow a handful of people to
Right.
come in, and they're regular. And when they go in, these people are armed. So The Hills Have Eyes is scary because
Right.
that stuff is real. And
Yeah.
and I know because I was just talking to her. She's like, no, it is scary and it's real.
Yeah.
And yeah.
So I think, anytime you have horror movies that are based on realism, right? Or real events that had taken place and they put their spin on it, there's always the ponderance of the what ifs, right? Like that could be real. Like that could have very well happened versus, that's something that's completely fictional, that had never happened. It's not as scary as something that could have been based on true events or real life incidences that happened, that these movies are loosely based off of, right? So I think there's the term of like, realism, and I think we pointed out the Amityville earlier, right? Like that was based on a real family, a son that killed his entire family, right? So what made him do that? Was it mental health issues? Was it schizophrenia, paranoia, or was he really possessed, right? And we don't know.
Yeah.
So it's kind of that realm of like, is anybody capable of doing that? And the answer is yes, right? Anybody could snap.
Yeah.
So that was very real. Whereas like a Friday the 13th is scary for what it is, but you're not going to have a guy in a hockey mask running around wielding, a machete and people believing that, right? Like that's not going to happen. If somebody did that,
if he does, somebody puts him down and he's not getting back.
So it's over, right? They're just,
true.
So I think that like the aspect of like realism and, kind of, I think that's why I said this earlier, but like the occult movies and ghost movies, I think are the more terrifying movies because those are real things, right? Like people have sacrificed people throughout the years, right? And ghost people believe, right? You're sitting there and you're like, did that pillow just move? Like, am I like, did I leave that door open? I remember closing that door. Why is it open, right? And it gets your mind thinking like you're psyching yourself out versus, that a masked man's not going to come in your house with a butcher knife and start killing you, right? Like it's realistically not going to happen. But you look and you're like, I turned those lights off. I know I turned. Why is it on? Right. And it's
right. Or what? One thing that is scary when we talk about stuff that could be real is it The Strangers with Liv Tyler's in it?
Yeah.
That movie Oh my gosh. Like it is long and drawn out and you'd think it was a sleeper, but it's so intense and scary. Like that freaked me out.
And there's no
Yeah.
rhyme or reason why those folks came to their house.
No.
Yeah.
No, it's just like they
No-
just picked them just
Yeah.
to mess with them.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah,
the sad thing is there are sick people out here in the
Sure.
world that just like to mess with people, you know?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
there was this home invasion movie that me and my mom watched. Where people were like living in their houses, but then they just randomly decided to kill the people and come out and harass them. And then we got into it, and it's something called frogging, where people genuinely go into
Yes.
crawl spaces and live there, and it's really creepy. And me and
Yeah.
my mom were terrified, and we started checking like the cubby holes in our houses because we have so many.
Well,
Yeah.
I think the boy kind of solidified that in terms of what is really going on, right? Like people that have been living in walls, right? In houses that have
It's house,
trap
so.
doors.
Yeah.
You
You
just
know,
creep me out because I have a crawl space under my house and the
you know,
access
it's,
is in my closet. Thanks, guys. Now I'm gonna have to go check it out.
you know, any movie with the basement, right? You kind of get that, you know, that wonky, like what's going on down there, right? Like what
Yes.
is it, you know? And it's like,
Yeah.
you know, anybody who has an old house with an unfinished basement has those fears every time they walk down, right?
Yes, it's crazy walking into an old house with a dirt basement because you wonder how many darn bodies are buried
Yeah,
under
right.
there. Like that's the first
Yeah.
thing I think of.
You
Like
know.
when we were looking at houses in Westfield and I saw dirt basement floors, I'm like, hey, no, you know.
Like when
And
we
even
first
when you look at those old farmhouses, right? And you're like,
Yes.
you know, somebody lives in the middle of nowhere, right? Like they are isolated as you can get, you know, and it's like, how do they manage, right? Like what do they do? And you ponder, right? Because you like all of a sudden, I think a Texas Chainsaw Massacre, right? Like you have a family that lives on a farm in an old rundown house, and you don't know what's going on inside of the house, and they could be a warm, loving family, but you always think the worst. You're never like, oh, they must be comfortable living in that old brackety house, right? You're like, those people are killers, right? Like they're psychopaths for living there, right?
the giant hole in our
Oh, so we've got a place in the basement that like there's a hole. It's behind our freezer, and it's just like a crawl space almost.
No, you can like walk in it.
Well, yeah, you can't walk straight up, but you can crawl in there.
Who's going down there?
We boarded it up.
Yeah, we got a board over it now. But yeah, it's like a big gaping hole in the middle of our basement. It's like it's under the house, but it's just like an area. Like you just like crawl in there.
Is
Yeah.
it an
No one
old?
wa-
Oh, well, I lived in the first house I lived in here in the village. We had an old cistern in our basement, but when I lived in Madison, the area in Madison was part of the Underground Railroad, and I owned a painting company, and I did a lot of painting, and I was always creeped out going in this one gal's house. I painted it in the basement. She literally had crawl tunnels under her basement. You would lift them up and you could see. I didn't go down there. I got dared to, but there was too many creepy crawly bugs. But the city actually came in and filled a lot of them up with concrete, but there were still tunnels underneath of the city connecting a lot of the houses and stuff. But it was creepy. It always creeped me out because I'd have to go down in the basement to wash out my paintbrushes and stuff, and I would look at those holes in the floor, and it was just creepy.
Yeah.
So
I can imagine, right? And the thing is that like, you know, our minds are designed to think the worst, right? Like you would, you know, you see a dark hole and you're like, you know, I'm not going in there. We're like, when you think about it, it's like, let me get a flashlight and go look, right? But like your mind always takes you to the worst possible scenario, right?
Right.
I know. I kept thinking there's some dude hiding down there or something, you know? I'm like, this is creepy. You know, this stuff is just creepy. Ugh.
Yeah, and it's weird too, because like I think, you know, a good horror movie will make you ponder afterwards about the possibilities of realism, right? Where like, you know, where you think twice about going to bed with, you know, the lights off, or you like, and I think those movies are like captivating when you watch them, because obviously, you know, somebody like, you know, us that are like movie fans and horror movie fans, you know, not much really gets to me now, right? Like, I don't watch a movie and say like, wow, that's going to make me stay up for days now because I can't go to sleep because I watched this movie, right?
Right.
But when you're 11, 12, 13 years old and you see these movies, there were a lot of times where I was like, man, I'm keeping the door cracked open. Like, I'm keeping a light on. Like, and now I think because a lot of it's been desensitized, right? Like, we're kind of used to the violence and the overwhelming aspect of it. But I don't remember a movie recently where I've watched it and I was like, wow, that is really awesome. And it's like kind of makes you think about, the possibility of. I haven't been affected that way in a while. And I remember the last movie that I saw that did that was The Conjuring.
Yeah, Smile.
Smile was good.
Yeah.
No, Boogeyman.
I didn't see that one.
Boogeyman was okay. Smile was a cool concept, right? About the possibility of, possession and mindset and, things like that.
What was
right?
that movie? It Follows? With the person who's possessed, like
that's thing. The car. The entity is chasing the car. Jeepers Creepers was kind of like that too.
Yeah.
For me, the movie that scared me as an adult was The Exorcism of Emily Rose, and I remember I watched it at a friend's house, and I was living alone, and there's that scene in there where the wind picks up in the dorm and the door goes kabam. Well, the apartment I lived in was a 3rd floor apartment. And when I had the back door open out to the fire escape, and we had a storm kick up that night, and I went home after watching it, and I was already creeped out. Like, and Gwen's like, I'm going to go crawl into bed with my kids. I'm like, great, I get to go home alone to my cat.
Right.
And I go home, and it was so hot. It was summer, and I had the doors open, and a thunderstorm was brewing. Well, the wind whipped through just right, and my back door went bam. I mean, I about peed myself. I literally did. It was bad, but that's like the only time that I can really think I've really been creeped out. Other than when I was a kid, there's a really old psychological horror called The Hand, and the hand crawls around and stuff. I would literally at night as a child, I ended up moving my bed by my light so I could shut it off, because I would shut the light off and I would run as fast as I could and jump into bed because I was afraid a hand was going to crawl out under that darn bed.
Yeah, and that's what I wait for, right? Like I'm waiting for the horror movie that as an adult makes me think about the reality and the realism of the movie, right? Like, could this possibly happen? Could this scenario be real? And is there the basis of like a moral compass, right? Where you're like, you consume the movie. And I've yet to find one, right? Where I've watched it and I was like, this movie, like, at least in the horror genre, right? Where it made me really terrified of a character or a concept. I've yet to find, I think it lacks.
The Strangers was like that. I think for me, that one, the concept of that, is pretty scary. And I've lived in the country a lot. And when you think about being alone and, just weird stuff like that. But yeah, I think that was probably the last movie that kind of really creeped me out. And yeah.
Mirah was saying Scream because of the idea of copycat killers. Yeah.
I think so. So I think I've made this statement for a lot of times, right? I think Scream in the entirety of a movie, right? I think that, obviously it's Wes Craven, right? The guy's written awesome horror movies. He's got a ton of movies under his belt. But I think Scream was the first like genre movie that was horror, but it was also like you could relate to it, right? You could relate to friends. You could relate to hanging out. You can relate to the weird people. You can relate to the imagery of the movie. Like Scream moved in a different kind of, almost an abnormal type of realm, right? Where it was like they presented the character and it wasn't far-fetched, right? Because it was like
you could see yourself in one of the character groups.
Right. And it's not uncommon for you to play pranks on your friends, right? When you call and you fake your voice. And like they're all freaked out and you got 4 people laughing behind you. So I think that was like, I think it kind of hit like for what it was, for the purpose when that movie was made, it just hit on every aspect of a good horror movie, right? Because it
Yes.
had the comedy, it had the wittiness, it had the what ifs, it had the who is it's. So Scream was very well done, and it's very underrated in a horror movie.
I
I think
agree
it
with
doesn't get
that.
the credit it deserves.
Yeah.
There's so many sequels too. I think that
Yeah.
kind of waters
also,
it down.
Yeah.
scary movie.
You know, and then
kind of-
again, whenever you have a hit,
Because
it's natural for Hollywood to keep making movies off the platform.
The parody, yeah.
You know, and it's not any fault of the movie, right? Like Scream didn't do anything wrong. It was a blockbuster hit. So of course they're going to say, let's make a sequel and we're going to keep going until they bomb, right?
Yeah.
And that's pretty much any horror movie that's good is going to do that, right? They're going to make a sequel. They're going to make a spinoff. They have to. It's a moneymaker, right? And none of them really ever make what the first one did, but it's money in their pocket. It's a budget movie and they know that they can brand it. And then Scream was really good with the merchandising, right? Because they put the ghost face on everything, right? It became almost an icon of the 90s, right? Like that was everywhere.
And it's still popular. Scream faces are still everywhere.
Right. You know, so that I think was the first appeal to, like, other than Jason, right? Because anyone can go to hockey mask, right? Like they were, but I mean, like Scream masks were at Walmart when the movie was out, right? It wasn't an uncommon thing. You see them go and pick it off the shelf in the store, right? So it wasn't anything that was like abnormally weird, right? It wasn't like a Michael Myers mask where like you had to make one or buy one in that realm, right? They were relatively available. I mean, they made hockey masks for 99 cents, right? They sell them in the dollar store, right? So the Scream masks were the same way. Like they were not uncommon to go buy one for $5 at Walmart.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, which I think is an appeal because, like, you know, you look at these overly done horror movies, it's no one can buy those masks, right? It's not a repetitive thing. It's the Scream was the first one that was like, you can make that outfit for $10.
Mm-hmm. You guys ever see the movie Hellfest? It's on Shudder.
Yeah.
Yeah,
this was good.
That's a cool movie because like the idea of, like, you know, being realistic and really happen, and how that movie ends. You know, I don't know if you want me to spoil it for you.
You can spoil it.
Okay. But yeah, so you have that killer that's killing all those kids at the theme park. You know, because it's basically like Great America during Fright Fest. You know, everybody's in costume. And the whole theme park is a haunted house now, but you got somebody going around killing people for real. You know, and like the killer gets away at the end, and when the killer's done, you see him walk to his car. He takes the mask off, walks to his car, and you literally follow him, driving. He drives and pulls up to a house, and then he walks in, and his woman said, "Oh, hey, honey, you're home from work," or something like that.
His daughter.
Oh, his daughter.
Yeah.
Okay, but bottom line, he comes home and he's a family man, and he just this killing spree and killed like 5 kids. Mm-hmm. Killed like 5 people, and he just comes home like he just came home from a day of work, but you never see his face. Like he has a mask the whole time. When he comes home, and he's like just regular average family man, and he just went on this killing.
Kind of like John Wayne Gacy, you know, like he was a family dude. I lived in Waterloo, Iowa. I grew up in Iowa, and every time, and he owned a Kentucky Fried Chicken there, and I remember driving by there all the time, and all I could think about every time was him, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
It's crazy. And I think that, like, you know, when you have the aspect of realism, right? Like, you know, everybody knows Dahmer, right? Like that's kind of like the modern day, like, go-to for horror movies. And, you know, you had Gacy and Ed Gein and, you know, all these other guys. But I think Dahmer was the one that, like, solidified normalcy, right? Like, here's a guy that goes to work every day. He's basically a normal person. Nobody ever thinks anything twice that this guy's a serial killer, right? And that he's a cannibal and that, you know, he's got, like, so I think that was kind of like the, you know, the closest thing to real life that you can get to horror. That was kind of like somebody that's sadistic is basically a normal person, right?
He was right here.
Oh yeah, if people said he was nice. People said he was polite. Like there was nothing, you know. It wasn't like you know, Ed Gein, where, you know, people said he was weird, but the local town was used to him, you know. And here's this quiet guy living in this apartment building and all that going on under their noses. It was like, wow. Yeah,
Yeah,
that was
it's
creepy.
and then I think that's what like the idea of like the horror genre I think is has its place in movie history, right? Because of the fact of you can make a movie where things could possibly happen, people get sick and they pass away, right? But like the horror movie genre is like the closest thing to like reality, right? When you think about it,
Yeah.
right? If somebody's going to snap and go on a killing spree, right? They're not going to do it in a passionate way, right? They're not going to be friendly, right? They're going to do it. And I think that's where like the horror movie genre kind of hits home for a lot of people, is because it's always the what if, right? You could say, oh, that guy lived next door to me for 20 years. I never thought in a million years he could kill 5 people.
But everybody
Right.
can relate to fear.
Right.
Everybody can relate to fear. Fear is an emotion we all experience,
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
that's why like horror movies and romantic comedies and certain things are always going to be stand the test of time, because we can all relate to being
Sure.
loved. We can all relate to being scared, like action movies. Like, okay, we can't all relate to being brave,
Right.
and facing all odds, and not everybody can relate to that. It's cool to watch somebody do it, on the screen, but we can't all necessarily relate to that. So that's why like action movies may not be, they kind of hit, they go
Sure.
through phases. But horror movies always going to be there. Love stories always going to be there, because we
Yeah.
can always relate to fear and we can always relate to love.
Yeah.
That is true.
Yeah. You're absolutely correct. I never thought of it that way. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's why I think, like I said, I think horror movies solidify their place in time, right? Because when you look at all the movies that have ever been made, right? Like on the big screen, even like silent movies, right? Most of them were all around like the horror genre. When you think about it, a lot of those silent movies were based on like, oddities, right? And like
Mm-hmm.
weird things happening and carnivals and like freak shows and stuff like that. Like those movies were made with just music, right? They were the weird things, right? It wasn't necessarily the fun things, right? It was
Mm-hmm.
always the spooky things.
And it's human nature to fear what we don't understand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, when you look at it, like, I'm not saying horror movies are the first movies ever made, but the genre was always there, right? In those, and even in those old silent movies, right? You had basically two different kinds of stories. Like James said, you had love stories and horror stories.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
that was it, right? And based on the music, you didn't know which one was which.
Or what about stuff like that could, like I'm thinking of the movie The Fly, where, messing with genetics
Yeah.
and,
Mhm.
things like that where you're altering, like, that's scary
Dr.
because,
Monroe.
we're already making sheep and other things, so
Yeah.
it's,
And I think that goes like when you look at modern science, right? And you kind of look at the story of like Frankenstein, right? Like how
Mhm.
many people have other people's body parts in them?
or
Right?
cryogenics. Think about
It's not,
people.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right. So, the idea of using different people's cells, right? Blood transfusions, right?
Yep.
Everyone gets them, right? But
Stem
you don't
cells.
think about the morphness of like what potentially could happen, right? But when you look at like I know James is a big comic book guy, right? But look at what happens when you genetically mutate somebody, right? Like they can get a superpower, they become psychic, they can move objects, right?
Well,
People
darn it, I don't glow in the dark yet. They genetically altered me, and it is real. Like when I was
So
going through cancer therapy with immunotherapy, they gave me immunotherapy, and it was literally mice DNA that they injected into my body to change my cells. I would go for a weekly infusion, and it was mice DNA that went in and combined with my cells. And so, like, it's not like so far off, to think about that
it's
stuff.
science fiction, right? Like stuff
Yeah.
that was
Mira's
done.
going to check out. She's got to work in the morning.
All right, you know what?
Good night.
We'll wrap it up. It's 11 o'clock. We started late.
Wow, it's
Let's
11
do-
o'clock. This is fun.
Let's do this. All right. We obviously had a great conversation. We talked a bunch of stuff. I want to get Ashley's perspective on a lot of stuff, right? I know James isn't a horror movie guy, but his perspective on movies is awesome, right?
Yes.
So let's plan a date next month where we can all four of us get on. We'll do it a little bit earlier and we can like deep dive into like what moves us, right? Like what what we like to watch, what kind of like we can go in that direction. We can kind of stick to the horror theme, but we could talk like movies in general, because I think, you know, a lot of people relate to different movies, but I think it's the one common denominator of a movie is like when people get scared, right? They want to be scared.
Yes.
It's a weird phenomenon, right? But like everybody's looking for the jump, right? Or the heart rate going up, or like, you know, the excitement of and horror movies are really the only
The
movies that
adrenaline of
bring that
fear
out.
without the actual danger.
Right. And I
Yeah.
think that's
Roller
the
coasters,
one
haunted houses, you know.
the one perspective of movies that like can really move people in terms of like actually being scared and like having their heart rate go up and like starting to sweat and get nervous and anxious is horror, right? No other movie can really do that, right?
No.
There's not many movies that can make people really change the demographic of their character, right? Like to actually be nervous and be scared and like waiting for the next jump, right?
Yeah.
Most other movies don't have that. Horror movie is like it brings you into the movie, right? Like you're engaged when you watch a horror movie, you're in it. You know, you watch a comedy or an action movie and there's something else going on. You're watching your phone, you're reading a book, you're kind of it's a background. But horror movie is like the one genre where like when you watch it, you're in it, right? Like
Yes.
yeah. And so, and that's, I think, is the appeal and the allure of like horror movies, because they're never really anybody's background movie, right? Nobody puts on a violently horror movie to, you know, watch, you know, it's a comedy or it's a movie they've seen 1,000 times, right? It's just background noise. But nobody puts on a horror movie to say, oh, I'm going to go, you know, read a book, but I'm going to watch, you know, American Psycho in the background.
You're right.
So I think that's the one, you know, when you watch a horror movie, it's like one of the few movies where you actually watch it, right? You pay attention, you try to figure out what's going on. You want to know who the killer is. You want to know how the victim, you know, the next person's going to die. Whereas other movies, like you can pretty much guess it, right? You're like, oh, well, that's the killer. The detective should know that. That's he gave it away, right? And the whole movie at the end, you're like, oh, I told you. See, I knew within 5 minutes. But horror is like the one genre where like you might think it's this, but then throughout the movie, you're like, well, wait a minute. I thought it was this person, but it's probably this person now, right?
Yeah.
So they intrigue you, they captivate you, where a lot of other movies don't really do that. You can figure it out relatively quickly.
Yeah.
So we'll wrap it up here though, but like we'll pick a night next month where we'll talk, like we'll deep dive into this. We'll get Ashley. Maybe we can, if one of your other friends want to pop on, maybe we can get like a big group, like, because the more people that discuss it, it's kind of cool because everybody has their unique, like, what is scary to them, right? Because what's scary to me might not be scary to you, and what might be funny to me might be horrifying to you, right? So it's kind of a unique perspective because it's the one genre where, you know, it's all the same, but everybody has a different take on it, right? Like what is really terrifying to some people is kind of laughable to somebody else, but what's terrifying to me, you might say, well, that's not really scary at all, right? So it's a kind of unique perspective.
Dan and Joey would both be really good. Joey actually does photo shoots where he dresses up like Freddy Krueger and stuff.
Okay.
And Dan, like, I don't know if Dan does haunted houses or stuff. I think he does haunted houses and stuff.
Yeah, see, that's unique, right? Because then they get firsthand of scaring people, right? Like, because everybody loves to scare people, right? Like, everybody wants to hide in the closet when their friend walks by. You jump out at you know, and you scare the shit out of somebody, and you laugh, right? And you're like, ah, funny, I scared you. And they're like ready to pass out with like horror, and you're like, you chuckle at it, right? But like working at a haunted house and like actually physically scaring somebody's got to be kind of a unique thing, right? Because everybody wants to be that guy, right? Nobody wants to be the one, you know, cautiously walking by and somebody jumps out and like scares the hell out of you, and you're like, what the hell, right? But you want to be the guy that does it, right? You're like, you know, everybody wants to be that person, right? Nobody wants to be on the other end of it.
That's right.
Yeah, so we'll deep dive next time. We'll wrap things up here. Thank you guys for being good guests as always. We always have fun when we're together. But we'll do this next month. We'll pick a day, we'll set it up, and then we'll continue this. We'll do a part 2 and then a part 3, and we'll get Ashley on. If you guys, she might post some stuff, but she had to put down a pet, so that's the reason she couldn't be here. It wasn't like she just blew us off. So you know, we all sympathize with Ashley. We, you know, sorry for your loss. We understand why you couldn't be with us tonight. So if you're watching this on the replay, that's the reason why Ashley wasn't here. It just wasn't because she didn't want to be here. So with that being said, guys, we'll say good night. Thank you for your time, and we'll see everybody next month.
All right.
All right.